Hello, team, and welcome to Doctor's Notes. This is Dr. Chriselle Nagallo. I'm a licensed naturopathic doctor in the state of Arizona, and I'm also adjunct faculty at Grand Canyon University, where I teach human anatomy and physiology. In this video, I highlight my key points in understanding the circulatory system. We will go over how a drop of blood moves from the heart and back to the heart, as well as some of the key points that are important in understanding how the heart works. So before I share a few slides, I want to give credit to the team at GCU from whom these slides are derived from, as well as the resources that they have used. So here we have an overview of the organization of the cardiovascular system. In anatomical nomenclature, we refer to blue as deoxygenated blood and red as oxygenated blood. The following key points may prove very handy in understanding how all of this works. So if you don't have this written down, I highly recommend that you do. An artery is going to be any blood vessel that brings blood away from the heart, whereas a vein is going to be any blood vessel that brings blood to the heart. Overall, on the left side of the heart, you're going to have oxygenated blood, and then on the right side of the heart, you're going to have deoxygenated blood. If you reference this image over here, this is the left side of the heart. We always look at it from anatomical left, where you see this area is in red, signifying oxygenated blood, whereas on the right side of the heart, we're seeing blue for deoxygenated blood. There is a difference between the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. In summary, the systemic circuit is what's going to bring blood from the heart to the rest of the body, with the exception of the lungs, because the lungs is going to be part of the pulmonary circuit. If you think about the whole purpose of blood, it is to bring oxygen from the lungs to various other tissues in the body, because those cells require access to oxygen for tissue cell metabolism. And then in exchange, that blood is going to take carbon dioxide, which is essentially metabolic waste from cells, bring it back to the heart and then to the lungs eventually, so we can breathe that carbon dioxide out. So in general, what happens is blood will always start in the atrium. We have two of them. And then we also have two ventricles, which are located inferior to those atria. There's going to be a left and right atria, so left and right atrium, and then a left ventricle as well as a right ventricle. So here we see the four chambers or rooms of the heart. By anatomical nomenclature, we start with the left ventricle as the starting point for tracing a drop of blood around the body. So here, blood starts in the left ventricle. It gets pushed into this aorta, which has a classic arch shape. One of the easiest ways to find the aorta on a cadaver if you are working with one. And then this blood that's traveling through the aorta will eventually travel to large, medium, and then smaller size blood vessels. And all of these blood vessels are going to contain oxygenated blood, because we're bringing oxygen from the heart to the tissues. Eventually, they're going to reach these smallest size blood vessels in the body, those known as capillaries. They have a really thin blood vessel wall, which allows and facilitates the exchange of those respiratory gases. This is where oxygen is given off from the red blood cells and to the surrounding tissues, and in exchange, those tissues will give carbon dioxide to the blood, which then officially starts venous return to the heart. So here we are deoxygenated blood, and we are bringing blood from the tissues back to the heart so that we can eventually get that blood oxygenated again. So blood that's deoxygenated is going to travel from capillaries and then eventually smaller medium, and then larger size veins, and then ultimately to the largest vein of the systemic circuit, that will be the inferior vena cava, and also the superior vena cava, depending on where that blood is coming from. So the inferior vena cava is going to collect all the deoxygenated blood that's coming from below the heart. So that includes the abdominal region as well as your two lower extremities. Whereas the superior vena cava is going to collect blood from anything that's coming from above the heart. And so that includes your two upper extremities as well as your neck, face, and brain. This deoxygenated blood is pulled and then collected in the right atrium, okay? And in the right atrium, blood is then pushed to the right ventricle. It's important to understand that blood is always going to move from the superior atria to the inferior ventricle in any contraction of the heart. There should be no backflow, and the heart has valves, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, to help prevent the backflow of blood. So here we are in the right ventricle, and now we are going to enter the pulmonary circuit. So we have deoxygenated blood. We want to get that blood reoxygenated again so that we can bring fresh new oxygen to the tissues of the body. So what happens here is the right ventricle pushes blood into the pulmonary trunk. Now, this pulmonary trunk will eventually bifurcate. That's a word, fancy medical word for splitting off. So the reason why it bifurcates is because half of the blood is going to be directed to the left lung, whereas the other half will be directed to the right lung. And then what you have here are the pulmonary arteries. So note here that these are arteries because we're bringing blood away from the heart, but here we have deoxygenated blood, whereas in the aorta, which was the largest artery of the systemic circuit, we were pumping blood from the left ventricle towards the rest of the body, and this artery, being a vessel that brings blood away from the heart, contained oxygenated blood. It is really important that you're able to make that distinction. So here, what happens is these pulmonary arteries will eventually bring blood to the lungs, where then gas exchange occurs with the alveoli in the lungs, where then carbon dioxide is given off to the lungs so we can breathe it out. And then in exchange, those red blood cells are going to bind fresh new oxygen. And then this is what then starts the oxygenated blood that's part of the pulmonary circuit. So now we have fresh new oxygenated blood. We want to get it back to the heart so that the heart can pump it to the rest of the body. And so what happens is this vessel is known as the pulmonary vein. Pulmonary because it's coming from the lungs, and it's a vein because it's going back to the heart. So remember that any blood vessel that brings blood to the heart is a vein. We're oxygenated, we just got fresh new oxygen, and so the pulmonary veins are going to contain oxygenated blood. The left atrium is what's going to receive the oxygenated blood, and then eventually the left atrium will push oxygenated blood into the left ventricle, and we are back where we started. So another key point to identify here is that the left atrium will always receive blood, and so there'll always be a vein that connects to it, whereas the left and right ventricle are going to push blood away from the heart, and so what you'll see is that it has an artery connected to it. In order to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria are what we call atrioventricular valves, appropriately named because they're found in between the atrium and the ventricle. You've got two of them, one on the left side and one on the right side. The one on the left side is also going to be known as the bicuspid valve because it's got two cusps, whereas the one on the right side, the right atrioventricular valve, is also known as the tricuspid because it has three cusps. Now, the left atrioventricular valve also has a third name. It's also known as the mitral valve. So be prepared to use those terms interchangeably and to see either or on a quiz or exam if you are taking my class at GCU. Another area where we want to prevent backflow is when those ventricles push blood out into their respective arteries. So what those valves are called are going to be the semilunar valves because of the half moon shape that they have on a heart model. And so on the right side, where you have blood being pushed from the right ventricle and into the pulmonary trunk, this semilunar valve is also known as the pulmonic valve, appropriately named. Conversely, on the left side of the heart, where you have the left ventricle pushing blood into the aorta, you're going to have a semilunar valve known as the aortic valve. Moving forward here, we're going to talk about the 3 layers of the heart walls. So from superficial to deep, you have the epicardium, myocardium, and then endocardium. Your epicardium is going to be the same thing as the visceral pericardium. That pericardium is going to be that cavity that surrounds the heart. The myocardium is going to be your middle layer. It is the thickest. It's going to be the thickest in the left ventricle because this left ventricle is responsible for pushing blood from the heart to all other parts of the body. And so it's tasked with a really difficult job. That thick myocardium of cardiac muscle tissue is going to help support the left ventricle in that role. The endocardium is going to be that innermost layer. It's going to be comprised of epithelial tissue. It's the inner surface of the heart, where it also includes some of the heart valves. Be able, if you are taking my class at GCU, to identify what myocardium tissue looks like on a histological slide. Reference the slides that have been posted for you. There is some features that you will expect to see in a cardiac muscle tissue slide that you won't expect to see in other types of muscle tissue. You want to make sure you look for presence of striation as well as the presence of intercalated discs. Another key concept is to understand the conduction system that drives the way the heart is pumping. So if you heard a heart under a stethoscope on auscultation, you should hear in a normal heart that characteristic lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound. And the heart has a specific rhythm. It is specially designed. It is all coordinated. This intricate coordination between nerve tissue and muscle tissue, which allows for nerve signal transmission throughout the heart to perfectly match up with the contractions of the aorta and the contractions of the ventricle. Key concept to understand here is the right atrium is where you find the sinoatrial node or that SA node. This is what sets the rate of rhythm for the heart. This is the body's natural pacemaker. That is a common question that's asked, so I would know that really well. What then happens is that nerve signal is then transmitted to the atrioventricular node located here. Notice it is located between the atria and their respective ventricles. This nerve signal is then transmitted down this bundle of His, which travels through the interventricular septum, the walls that separate the left and right ventricle, and then eventually that nerve transmission is pushed forward towards the surrounding Purkinje fibers, which are found in the outer walls of the ventricles. And this is what explains the contraction that first is seen in the atrium before the ventricles. Keep in mind that the atria, the left and right, will contract together to together push blood from the respective atria to the ventricle in the right and left side. And then once that nerve signal is transmitted From the bundle of His and around the Purkinje fibers, then follows the contraction of the left and right ventricle together so that blood is pushed out from those ventricles into the respective arteries, the aorta on the left side from the left ventricle, and then the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle, and so on and so forth does blood move throughout the systemic and pulmonary circuits. If you are taking my class at GCU, you're still responsible for identifying some of the key structures that are highlighted in your terms list found under Loud Cloud. This video was designed to summarize the key concepts and understand the circulatory system. If you have any further questions with regards to this topic, please feel free to reach out on Loud Cloud or comment in the sections below. Thank you so much for spending time with Doctor's Notes. I hope you find this very helpful in your studies. Happy studying.